You're watering every single day. You're deadheading spent blooms. You're applying mulch every spring and fighting the same pests every summer, and your garden still looks tired by August. Here's the truth most people miss. You're not failing at gardening. You're succeeding at a broken system designed around intervention and dependence. The plants you're growing need you, and that's the entire business model. What I'm about to show you goes against everything garden centers taught you. These 20 forbidden plants don't need you. They're banned or restricted in some places specifically because they thrive without inputs, outcompete monocultures, and reproduce aggressively. For a homeowner drowning in maintenance, that's the feature you've been searching for. Here's what most people miss about forbidden plants. The term itself reveals the entire problem with modern gardening. When a plant gets labeled invasive, banned, or restricted, regulators are usually protecting large-scale monoculture agriculture, not helping homeowners build resilient yards. These plants spread aggressively because they've mastered survival without human intervention. They fix nitrogen, mine deep minerals, create living mulch, and establish symbiotic relationships with soil organisms. That's exactly what you want in a self-regulating garden, but it's terrible for an industry built on selling you inputs every season. Think about it. Let's start with Comfrey. Banned or restricted in some regions because it spreads through root division and grows so vigorously that it outcompetes ornamental landscapes. Comfrey sends a taproot down 6 to 10 feet, breaking through hardpan and pulling up minerals that shallow-rooted plants can't reach. When you cut the leaves and drop them in place, you're creating a nutrient-dense mulch that feeds everything around it. The plant regrows from that same deep root system, giving you 4 to 6 harvests per season. You're not buying fertilizer. You're not importing compost. The system builds fertility while you do other things with your weekend. But here's the reality garden centers won't tell you. Comfrey also attracts pollinators, produces biomass faster than almost any temperate zone plant, and tolerates neglect that would kill hybrid roses. Banned because it works too well. Restricted because it doesn't need you. If you plant it near fruit trees, the deep roots mine calcium and potassium, the chop and drop leaves feed soil biology, and the flowers support the same insects that pollinate your apples. One plant, 3 critical functions, 0 purchased inputs. Stinging nettle is another regulatory target, prohibited in some agricultural zones because it spreads through rhizomes and seeds prolifically. You're supposed to see that as a problem. Indigenous systems saw it as a dynamic accumulator that concentrates iron, magnesium, and nitrogen in its leaves. When you harvest nettle and steep it in water for 2 weeks, you get a liquid fertilizer that costs nothing and feeds heavy feeders like tomatoes and squash. The plant continues producing new growth from its perennial root system. You're not buying bottled nutrients. You're harvesting them from plants that want to grow. Here's where it gets interesting. Nettle also provides early season habitat for beneficial insects, including predatory species that control aphids and caterpillars. Meanwhile, you're spraying pesticides on plants bred to be defenseless. The contrast is brutal. Nettle manages its own pest relationships through chemical compounds in its leaves. It spreads into bare soil and holds it against erosion. It grows in shade or sun, wet or dry, and improves soil structure as its roots die back and decompose each season. This is what a self-regulating system looks like, and it's classified as a nuisance. Yarrow gets banned from pasture seed mixes and discouraged in ornamental landscapes because it self-seeds aggressively and forms dense colonies. You're told it's invasive. Observation reveals something different. Yarrow's finely divided root system aerates compacted soil. Its flowers attract parasitic wasps, lacewings, and hoverflies, all of which prey on garden pests. The plant tolerates drought by going dormant, then rebounds with the first rain. You're not watering. You're not replacing dead annuals. The system persists through stress cycles that would devastate a typical garden bed. This is where companion relationships become critical. Plant yarrow near brassicas, and you get increased populations of beneficial insects that control cabbage moths and aphids. Plant it near aromatic herbs, and the combined volatile compounds confuse pest insects searching for host plants. The flowers also accumulate sulfur, phosphorus, and potassium, making the chop and drop leaves a balanced soil amendment. One plant, installed once, providing multiple services indefinitely. That's the design principle garden centers actively work against, because if you install it once, you're not a repeat customer. Chicory appears on invasive species lists in multiple states because it escapes cultivation and establishes in disturbed ground. But here's what most people miss. The deep taproot, sometimes reaching 10 feet, breaks hardpan and mines calcium from subsoil layers. When the plant dies back, that root channel becomes a pathway for water infiltration and habitat for soil organisms. You're building soil structure passively. Chicory also produces edible leaves in spring and fall, provides nectar for pollinators during summer heat when many flowers shut down, and self-seeds into gaps without any input from you. Here's the reality. Chicory thrives in poor soil, meaning it colonizes the areas where your expensive ornamentals struggle. Instead of amending soil and fighting failure, you let chicory establish, harvest the greens, chop and drop the flower stalks, and watch soil quality improve over 2 to 3 seasons. Then you can introduce more demanding crops if you want, or you can leave the chicory in place and enjoy a system that requires zero maintenance. Banned because it spreads, successful because it doesn't need your intervention. Lamb's quarters is illegal to sell as seed in some states and actively eradicated by conventional gardening advice, even though it's more nutritious than spinach and grows without irrigation, fertilization, or pest management. The plant germinates in disturbed soil, grows rapidly, and produces thousands of seeds before you even notice it's there. You're told to pull it. Indigenous systems harvested it. The leaves contain more protein, calcium, iron, and vitamin A than cultivated greens. The plant shades soil, reducing evaporation and suppressing less useful weeds. When you harvest the top growth, it regrows from lower nodes. When you let it go to seed, it fills empty spaces the following season. Think about it this way. You're buying lettuce starts, watering them daily, watching them bolt in heat, and replanting every 6 weeks. Meanwhile, Lamb's quarters volunteers in the same bed, tolerates neglect, produces more edible mass per square foot, and improves soil tilth as its roots decompose. This isn't a weed. It's a crop that doesn't require you to manage it. That's exactly why conventional systems label it invasive. Now let's talk about plants that get the invasive label specifically because they're too successful at building resilient ecosystems. Jerusalem artichoke, banned in some ornamental landscapes and agricultural zones, spreads through tubers and can colonize an area in 2 seasons. You're supposed to see that as aggression. Here's what most people miss. Observation shows you a perennial sunflower relative that produces edible tubers, grows 10 feet tall to provide vertical structure, attracts pollinators, and builds soil organic matter as the massive root system dies back partially each year. The plant needs zero fertilizer, tolerates poor drainage and drought, and produces food without replanting. But here's the reality. Jerusalem artichoke works as a living fence or windbreak, reducing evaporation in beds behind it. The tall stalks create microclimates that protect heat-sensitive crops during summer peaks. The tubers store in the ground through winter, meaning you harvest as needed instead of processing and storing a single large harvest. When you leave some tubers in place, they regrow the following spring. You're not buying seed. You're not tilling and replanting. The system perpetuates itself, which makes it useless to an industry built on annual sales cycles. Think about it. The plant also functions as a nutrient pump. Those deep tubers pull potassium and phosphorus from subsoil layers and deposit them in the topsoil as leaves decompose. Combine Jerusalem artichoke with nitrogen-fixing ground covers like clover, and you're building complete soil fertility without purchased amendments. One plant at the edge of your property, ignored for 3 years, becomes a perennial food source and a fertility engine. Banned because it spreads, perfect because it requires nothing from you. White clover appears on prohibited species lists for lawn seed mixes in some municipalities, even though it fixes nitrogen, tolerates foot traffic, stays green through drought, and feeds pollinators. You're told to maintain pure grass monocultures that require weekly mowing, regular fertilization, and constant irrigation. Meanwhile, clover does everything grass does, plus it improves soil without inputs. The plant forms nodules on its roots where bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen into plant-available forms. When those roots die and decompose, they release nitrogen that feeds surrounding plants. Here's the contrast that should make you angry. You're applying synthetic nitrogen that leaches into groundwater, runs off during rain, and requires repeated applications. White clover applies nitrogen continuously, directly into the root zone, without runoff or waste. The plant also flowers throughout the growing season, supporting honeybees and native pollinators during periods when many gardens offer nothing. It spreads through stolons, filling bare patches and outcompeting weeds that would otherwise require herbicides or hand pulling. This is where it gets interesting. Lawn care companies sell you a service model built on keeping grass barely alive. White clover makes that model obsolete. It reduces mowing frequency because it stays lower than grass. It eliminates fertilizer costs because it creates its own nitrogen. It cuts water consumption by 50% or more because the deep roots access moisture that shallow grass roots can't reach. This is why it's banned from conventional lawn mixes, not because it fails, but because it succeeds without creating dependency. Dandelion gets eradicated with more chemical firepower than most plants, despite being one of the most useful species you can establish in a food garden. The taproot reaches down 3 to 6 feet, breaking compacted soil and pulling calcium from deep layers. When the plant dies, that root channel becomes a highway for water infiltration and airflow. The leaves are more nutritious than lettuce, appearing early in spring when few other greens are available. The flowers provide critical early nectar for pollinators emerging from winter. The seed heads feed birds. Every part of the plant serves multiple functions, and it accomplishes all of this without any care from you. But here's what most people miss. You're spending money on transplants that need watering, weeding, and pest management. Dandelion volunteers, persists through neglect, and improves the soil around it as a dynamic accumulator. The plant concentrates potassium, phosphorus, and calcium in its leaves. When you chop and drop those leaves, you're creating a mineral-rich mulch that feeds everything nearby. When you let some plants go to seed, they fill gaps in your garden the following year. This is the self-regulating cycle that modern gardening deliberately disrupts. Here's the reality that makes dandelion dangerous to the garden industry. Once established, it doesn't need you. It doesn't need irrigation systems, fertilizer programs, or pest controls. It makes those products obsolete, which is exactly why conventional wisdom treats it as enemy number one. Meanwhile, indigenous systems and traditional European gardens harvested dandelion as a crop, recognizing that a plant this resilient and nutritious should be cultivated, not eradicated. Purslane is illegal to sell in some states and actively suppressed by agricultural extension services even though it contains more omega-3 fatty acids than any other leafy vegetable and grows in conditions that would kill cultivated greens. The plant germinates in hot soil, thrives in drought, and spreads across bare ground to form a living mulch that reduces evaporation and blocks weed germination. You're watering lettuce twice daily and watching it bolt. Purslane grows during peak summer heat without irrigation, produces succulent edible stems and leaves, and reseeds itself for the following season. Think about it. The stems root at nodes when they touch soil, meaning the plant clones itself and expands coverage without flowering. This is what regulators call invasive. This is what you should call a solution to summer vegetable gaps and water scarcity. Purslane also improves soil structure as its shallow root mat breaks up surface crusting and adds organic matter when it dies back in fall. The plant tolerates foot traffic, grows in containers or cracks in pavement, and asks nothing from you except occasional harvest to keep it from overwhelming more delicate crops. Here's where companion relationships become critical. Purslane growing under tomatoes and peppers creates a living mulch that keeps soil cool and moist, reducing blossom end rot and heat stress. The plant's succulent leaves store water, creating a microclimate buffer during temperature swings. When you harvest purslane, you're getting a vegetable that outproduces lettuce per square foot and provides nutrition that most greens can't match. When you ignore it, it continues spreading, shading soil, and building organic matter. Either way, you're not managing it, it's managing itself. Plantain, the broadleaf perennial that appears in every lawn and garden path, gets targeted by herbicides despite being one of the most medicinally valuable plants in temperate climates. The plant tolerates compaction that kills most species, sending roots through hard soil and creating channels for water and air movement. The leaves contain compounds that reduce inflammation and promote wound healing. Indigenous communities across multiple continents used plantain as a first aid plant for insect stings, minor cuts, and skin irritation. You're buying products to solve problems this plant addresses for free, and you're paying additional money to kill the plant that provides the solution. Think about it. Plantain grows where you walk, which means it establishes in the highest traffic, most compacted areas of your property. Instead of fighting to grow grass in these spots, you could let plantain colonize them, harvest the leaves for medicine or food, and benefit from the soil improvement as those deep roots break up compaction. The plant also produces seed stalks that feed birds and provide visual interest if you stop seeing it as a weed. When you change your perspective from eradication to observation, Plantain becomes a soil remediation specialist that volunteers for the hardest jobs in your landscape. Here's where it gets interesting with edible perennials that conventional wisdom wants you to ignore. Tree collards, restricted in some zones and unavailable through most commercial channels, are a perennial form of collard greens that can live for 10 years or more in mild climates. The plant grows as a woody shrub, producing edible leaves year-round in frost-free areas and through most of the year in zones with occasional freezes. You're replanting annual greens every season, losing crops to pests and weather, and starting over each spring. Tree collards establish once, grow larger each year, and produce more food as they mature. But here's what most people miss. The plant also propagates through cuttings, meaning you buy or acquire one plant, then clone it indefinitely by sticking stem cuttings in soil. You're never buying seed again. You're sharing cuttings with neighbors, establishing a perennial food source that requires occasional harvest and nothing else. Tree collards tolerate partial shade, poor soil, and irregular watering. The leaves contain more nutrition than annual collards, and the plant produces during months when few other vegetables are available. This is the model that makes seed companies irrelevant, which explains why you won't find it at garden centers. Good King Henry, banned from commercial sale in some regions, is a perennial vegetable that produces edible shoots in spring like asparagus, edible leaves through summer like spinach, and edible flower buds in fall. The plant establishes from seed or root divisions, then persists for decades with zero maintenance beyond harvest. You're tilling and replanting annual beds every year. Good King Henry grows in the same spot for 20 years, improving soil structure as its roots expand and decompose at the margins. Here's the reality. The plant also tolerates shade, which means you can establish it under fruit trees or in areas where sun-loving annuals fail. It self-seeds moderately, filling gaps without becoming aggressive. When you harvest the spring shoots, you're getting a crop that's ready weeks before asparagus. When you harvest the leaves, you're getting greens that don't bolt in heat like lettuce and spinach. When you ignore it completely, it continues living and producing, waiting for you to remember it exists. This is food security through design, not through constant intervention. Sea kale, restricted in coastal areas, where it's considered native and protected, produces edible shoots, leaves, and flower buds while tolerating salt spray, drought, and poor soil. The plant grows as a large perennial that looks ornamental enough to satisfy HOA requirements while producing food for decades. You're replacing annual vegetables that need perfect conditions. Sea kale thrives in conditions where most crops fail, and it does so with zero fertilizer, minimal water, and no pest management. Think about it this way. Here's the pattern you should be seeing by now. Every plant on this list solves multiple problems simultaneously. They build soil while producing food. They manage water while attracting pollinators. They persist through neglect while improving conditions around them. This is what self-regulating systems look like, and it's exactly what modern gardening teaches you to destroy. You're told these plants are weeds, invasives, or prohibited species. Observation tells you they're solutions to problems your current approach creates. Now let's talk about implementation, because understanding these plants means nothing if you don't know how to integrate them into your property without violating local regulations or HOA restrictions. Start with 3 to 5 plants this season. Don't try to transform your entire yard at once. Pick species that solve your specific problems. If you're fighting compacted soil, start with Comfrey and Dandelion. If you're tired of watering, add Purslane and white clover. If you want perennial food, choose tree collards or Good King Henry. Install them, observe what happens, and expand next year based on what you learned. But here's the reality about HOA compliance. Focus on plants that look ornamental or can be disguised as conventional landscaping. Yarrow passes as an ornamental perennial. Sea kale looks like an architectural accent plant. Tree collards can be pruned to resemble ornamental shrubs. White clover, mixed into grass lawns, at low percentages often goes unnoticed until your lawn stays green while your neighbor's turns brown during drought. You're working within restrictions while building a system that quietly outperforms conventional landscapes. Container strategies work for renters or anyone with limited ground space. Comfrey grows productively in large pots, providing chop and drop material for smaller containers around it. Purslane thrives in shallow containers and hanging baskets. Good King Henry adapts to container culture if you give it a pot at least 12 inches deep. You're not locked out of these systems because you don't own property. You're adapting the same principles to the space you have, building soil and growing food in a movable format. Here's what most people miss about seed saving. It becomes automatic with these plants. Yarrow, Dandelion, Purslane, and lamb's quarters all self-seed aggressively. Let a few plants go to seed in an out-of-the-way corner, and you'll have volunteers the following season. Collect seed from your strongest plants and share it with others who want to build resilient gardens. You're creating a local seed network that doesn't depend on commercial suppliers. The plants themselves want to reproduce. You're just allowing it to happen instead of fighting it. Here's the reality that should change how you think about garden design. After 2 to 3 growing seasons with these plants established, your soil structure improves to the point where water infiltration increases by 60 to 80%. You're watering less because the soil holds more moisture. You're fertilizing less because the plants build their own fertility. You're spending fewer weekends on maintenance because the system regulates itself through plant relationships you've observed and supported rather than controlled. This is where it gets interesting with long-term thinking. You're not gardening for this season. You're designing a system that becomes more productive and less demanding over time. The first year requires some effort to establish plants and observe how they interact. The second year requires less intervention as root systems expand and relationships stabilize. By the third year, you're harvesting food and managing abundance rather than fighting failure and replacing dead plants. The system compounds in your favor instead of depleting your time and money. Stop paying garden centers to sell you solutions to problems your design created. Stop spending Saturdays fighting the same issues that return stronger each week. Start this weekend.